Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Today we're going to go to Amherst, Massachusetts, and we're going to meet a sociology professor, which is going to be fun because I'm a sociologist and we ought to have something in common since we both do peace things. And his name is Stellan Vindhagen, and I'm not even sure I'm pronouncing it right because we are just now getting acquainted. Never met before. Have I mispronounced your name already, Stellan?
No, that's perfect.
Vindhagen.
Yes.
All right. And you're Swedish, and you are in Amherst, Massachusetts at the University of Massachusetts, right?
Yes, that's correct. I have been working many years in Sweden and in Europe as an activist and as a researcher. And then I got a job as an endowed chair in the awesome position of focusing on nonviolent direct action and resistance studies in 2014 at University of Massachusetts.
So you've been there since 2014.
Yes.
Well, it's my fault that we haven't connected before because we certainly should have. And, you know, I must say, I'm impressed that you got a job in sociology teaching direct action, because although I created a peace and conflict studies program at my campus of the University of Toronto, they would never have hired me to teach direct action. And I didn't come anywhere near trying to teach students how to do things of that kind. Do you actually give instructions on how to go about blockading an arms installation or something of that kind?
Yeah, I actually do. I have done nonviolent direct action trainings together with students.
Mm-hmm.
But my teaching is mostly a matter of critically engaging with the problems and challenges that activists face when they are applying these kind of tactics and strategies of struggling. I think it's a possibility for making students and activists more aware of the different ethical, political challenges that we face when we are trying to do political campaigns and have some impact in the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's just where we should go with that. Although let me detour briefly by asking, is Johan Jorgensen there too? Do you know Johan?
Yeah, we have been we're working together, but he's not there. He works in Sweden.
Because I tried to reach him a while ago, and I heard that he was in Massachusetts, and I thought, well, it sounds like you guys are a team working on something together. But he's in Sweden, huh? Okay. Well, anyway, I've caught you, so it's time to get caught up about sociology and the use of sociology for public. I mean, I love the notion of public sociology, you know.
Right.
And so tell me, I see another thing of interest in your curriculum. I Googled you, and it says that you're also an adjunct professor of psychology and brain sciences. So that didn't fit any of the other publications that I saw on your list. And I wonder what your angle is in sociology and brain science.
Well, to be really honest, it's mostly an honorary position because I collaborate with the Peace Center that is based at psychology and brain science. Mm-hmm. And the Peace Center is working on a number of issues that has to do with conflict resolution, and they're also paying interest for nonviolence. Mm-hmm. So it's because of that collaboration, not because of my knowledge when it comes to psychology or brain science.
Okay, so mainly your claim to fame is being a direct action man. All right, an activist.
Yes.
Now we should actually perhaps maybe give an overview of the different types of activism, because, you know, there are plenty of activists. For myself, for example, I have never been arrested. To my shame, I have to admit I've never been arrested. I've never done direct action really at all. I mean, sort of an academic. I think every decent human being ought to get arrested a few times. And I have not made my quota yet, but I can claim to be an activist. So it might be worthwhile talking about the different ways in which people can be and are engaged with peace activism and other. I presume you're also assisting people who want to be activists in other social areas, such as environmental areas, climate change, things of that sort. Is that right?
Yes, I'm trying to develop knowledge together with activists, and I have a background as an activist myself in various different movements, including the environmental movement, to figure out ways where we can have an impact for liberation and social justice. So I think it gets often a media attention when people are getting arrested. That's not the main thing. The main thing is to change our societies towards a more peace and just society. I just happen to believe that nonviolent direct action, including getting arrested, is one of the key parts that is needed. But of course, people need to work with many other methods, and academic research, you and I, we certainly believe that that is part of what is needed. There is also a need for other forms of activism. And I also want to underline that when people get arrested, there are many more people that are needed to give support, and to participate in media, participate in debates, and there is so much more that is needed. But of course, those people that get arrested get some of the media attention, but I think it needs to be part of an integrated social change strategy. That's kind of an important point, I think.
I think that may be part of the lesson we're learning these days when we find that so many of the civil resistance movements are not doing as well as they used to.
Right.
And I think it's worthwhile giving some attention to that fact, because I'm not sure how many people in the public are aware of the fact that there was, it was a very successful strategy or approach 10, 15 years ago. And of course, we know about the wonderful book by Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan, showing how important and how much more desirable that approach was, or more effective it was than the use of violence. But more recently, it's not been so effective. And I have the impression, maybe you don't know whether that's true or not, but maybe it is, that in the general public, people are just beginning to catch up to the old truth, which was that it was a very effective thing. Yeah. And they haven't yet caught up to the fact that it's not working as well. We need to be honest about what's going on and maybe speculate, or maybe you have actual evidence as to why some of the movements that we've been trying in the last few years are not working. I suppose that's part of the general trend toward right-wing populism around the world, but I really don't know. What do you think? So
I have one reflection on that earlier success, which I think needs to be a little bit questioned. But I also have two main points where I think we can see the reason why it's not so effective anymore. So firstly, about the effectiveness that has been shown by, as you say, with very solid evidence from Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan, but also a number of other researchers, among them at Uppsala in Sweden, that has confirmed these astonishing successful results from nonviolent social movements over the years, even against militarized dictatorships, right?
Mhm.
Much more effective than armed means that you and I are old enough to remember when people that were belonging to any kind of radical movement were always convinced that armed means are so much more effective in changing society. But that's so interesting that it's been shown now that that's not true. It's unarmed means that are much more effective. Okay. But the problem that hasn't really been recognized, I think, in that research is that these movements have been effective in overthrowing dictatorships, overthrowing authoritarian regimes, right?
Mhm.
But if we look at the results afterwards, there has been not so much change of the societies as we would wish. There's been so much less of social justice, so much less of a more fundamental change in society. And I think that needs to be recognized, that that's part of the problem. You know, what we have seen, for example, in Egypt is that they were effective in overthrowing the regime, but they didn't really have an idea what kind of new society did they want to have instead, right?
Mhm.
And that contributed to the chaos that developed afterwards with the Muslim Brotherhood and their new authoritarian leadership style. So I think what is a part of the problem here that needs to be recognized is that nonviolent movements have been very effective in overthrowing regimes, but they have not been so clear about what kind of new society do they want. And that also leads me to what I think is part of the reason why is it not so effective today. And I think it's partly a matter of that regimes have learned they're much more skilled in dealing with nonviolent social movements. That's part of the problem. Another part of the problem is that I find that these movements and the organizers of them are not really developing the full potential of nonviolent means. And you know, you and I, we would be aware that Gandhi emphasized that there is an important element in a nonviolent struggle, which is about building up the constructive program, to actually build up the idea, the alternatives, the visions of what other new society do you want. Gandhi didn't get much of the understanding of that strategy from his fellow activists within the anti-colonial struggle, but it's the same today, that people are more focused on getting rid of authoritarian leaders than actually creating alternatives, right?
Yeah.
But it's also that it seems like there are trends in what kind of tactics to use to occupy squares or certain methods that people adopt, because they see it has been used otherwise at other places. But there's a full repertoire with so many different tactics to be used. You know, and Erica Chenoweth is one that emphasized that also, that sometimes methods needs to be concentrated with many people in the capital in big protest. At other times, you need to have a dispersed strategy where people are boycotting or refusing to go out, and you empty the streets. And that's more difficult to repress with military means and massacres. So the tactical skills of activists needs to be more developed and seen where to apply in what context and so on. So I think there's a lot of learning to be done by activists to really manage these methods. And unfortunately, it seems to me, I don't have specific evidence on it, but I know as a fact that a number of regimes, including China, Russia, and Iran, and United States and European Union, are developing their own knowledge about protest methods. So obviously, they are developing their counter strategies.
Yeah.
You couldn't do the Seattle protests, from 1999. You can't do that at top meetings today because the police are prepared. They know how to deal with these protests. They were not in Seattle in 99. So in the same way, activists needs to be developing their tactics and be more skilled and more knowledgeable. And I think that's where you and I come in, and people that are interested in seeing, okay, So what can we learn from struggles? What are the challenges people are dealing with? Not because we would have the recipe of what to do, but because we would say that there are a number of challenges here that you need to consider.
Mm-hmm.
And you need to have a broader repertoire so that you can be flexible in the struggle and not just repeat certain tactics that seem to have worked before.
Okay, that makes perfect sense to me. And in fact, it's not a unique point of view. I think Erica has written a little bit about that, and she has another book coming out about it. But, I've also heard that in a way it may be the case, and whether you think so, that that the very ease of using our cell phones to mobilize a crowd may have tempted people to do that before they were ready to if suppose they the guys in power just turn over the keys to the palace and go away, and these guys out in the square haven't a clue what they really want to do the next day. And I used to know Gene Sharp pretty well, and I remember one time I kind of said, in fact, it was after the Arab Spring began to fail that I began to change my own opinion, I guess, about what needed to be done in terms of preparing for an action of that kind, trying to get rid of dictators and so on. And I said it seemed to me that there needed to be a lot of political creating a shadow cabinet or something of that kind, work in advance to create a game plan of what you want to do if you succeed, and work out the politics of the thing before going into real direct action. And he thought that wasn't correct. He said that his job was just to show people how to get rid of the dictator, and it wasn't his job to talk about what to do afterwards. So I still kind of think that's the case, but it's even more the case now, I believe, because cell phones are so ubiquitous that it's really pretty easy to send a message out saying, meet us at 5 o'clock in the plaza and protest. But if these people don't have any way of getting acquainted with each other, because they don't have real meetings, they don't have discussions, they don't have, planning sessions, then I think they're just not ready for it. And I'm a little bit more cautious about supporting the idea of some sort of resistance, even when I think it's ultimately very necessary and desirable. Are we in sync, or maybe you disagree?
No, we are definitely in sync here. I think gathering the masses in a protest might be very powerful in a situation of state of emergency where people are afraid to speak out, and suddenly they see thousands of others being out there on the street. It scares totally a dictator, right? Mm-hmm. So it might be very powerful, and social media can be very helpful in that. But we also know that social media is an intensively easy tool for surveillance of people. So it's also used very, very much as a tool against activists. Mm. So to create networks and to see how it spreads and all that. So it gives the authorities the possibility to map the networks and the activists. So for the longer struggle, it's something of a double-edged sword, right? So I think as soon as we have to do with governments that are more sophisticated, that are not just trying to make people afraid of showing their opinions, that are crumbling as soon as thousands are gathering at the square, which are some regimes are that crude. But as soon as we have to do with more sophisticated regimes, it's much more complicated. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And actually, I think we can see that clearly, that the statistics given by the people from Uppsala and Chernobyl and others, it's mainly dealing with the changes that are happening in authoritarian regimes. So what about the changes and the impact that we do in the United States and Europe and other liberal democracies? That's much more difficult to see, right? We have had the biggest protests in the US history the last couple of years with the Women's March and the Black Lives Matter. What's the result of them? Zero.
Well, that's a pessimistic view, but I guess you're right. I haven't really thought about what the effect has been, but yeah, you probably are right. Okay, so there should have been building an organization or a movement where people get acquainted and talk about things beforehand. Is that what you would say? What if you were in charge of revitalizing the Black Lives Matter or the women's movement or the Me Too movement? That's an improbable assignment, but what would you? How would you change things?
So I think that protests are important, but I think they're overrated, particularly in a liberal democracy. Mm-hmm. So I think a first thing that I would change would be to shift the focus from protest towards more what has been the basis of strength of social movements throughout history, which has been to build more of a neighborhood and more social networks, group-based kind of a movement that is built from below and up, right? So more like the way that people could create more of autonomous communities, more of their own change in their own neighborhoods. And from that, they also sometimes go out and do protest, of course. Mm-hmm. But as soon as it's when we are individualized people that are connecting through social media and we go to a protest, particularly in the DC or in some other capital in the world, we are not really connected to each other, right? And I think that's the weakness that is lost somehow in this very social media based, protest oriented kind of quick mobilization. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Because I think we need to realize that a protest in a liberal democracy doesn't really work in the same way as a protest in an authoritarian regime that is building on fear. In a liberal democracy, it actually thrives on having protests because it shows that it is still a democracy somehow. Mm. So it's no problem for a president in the US if there are protests in Washington. It's actually part of the vibrant democracy of the US. So if the president listens to the protest, it shows that the president is reasonable and responsive to mm-hmm. people's opinions. And it just shows the president to be even more powerful afterwards. If he doesn't listen, it just shows that the protest is weak and we don't really have the power in our protest. So it's a double bind. Mm-hmm. I think much more like if we look at examples like the Corporation Jackson in Mississippi that is organized by people from the Malcolm X grassroots movement, they're trying to build up neighborhood communities. They're building up land trusts together. They're trying to create more of job opportunities for Black folks living there in Jackson, Mississippi. And they are competing in local elections, trying to influence the local politics. At the same time as they're very clearly anti-imperialist against Washington. They're not trying to just do reform local politics, but they're trying to mobilize a strength by having a strength within the local community. And the same strategy is applied by the Zapatistas in Mexico. They're building their own local communities because they know the government is not interested to give indigenous people their rights. So they're building up their own health clinics, their own education system based on indigenous values and principles, right?
Has there been a shift from local organizing to kind of social media platform organizing, where it's almost even virtual. Your relationships, you may not have even met a person in the flesh.
Yeah.
Your partners.
But sorry for interrupting, but I would say that I agree. We cannot stay in the local. That's not my suggestion. Is not to stay in the local. Mm-hmm. My suggestion is this: that if we want a vibrant, strong social movement that is going to actually transform society and not just shifting one decision, we need to have movements that are rooted in their communities. And then they connect to each other. The communities are connecting to each other and mobilizing on national and international level. I think that's necessary, and that takes time. That's the way that the Republican right have been doing. They have been working for decades in building up a basis in the grassroots, and they've been working towards changing the Supreme Court for so many decades. And I think we need a similar long-term strategy based on where is the real power of people power. Well, it's based among people in neighborhoods. It's not based in social media. Social media is a tool. It's a tool for.
I want to disagree with you. I think that there are types of people. There are people who are local minded and people who are definitely cosmopolitan, if you will, the old terminology for globalizers.
Right.
And I'm a globalizer. And it's sometimes embarrassing when I have to vote. We just had an election here in Canada.
Okay.
I frankly didn't vote. I don't even know who to vote for.
No.
I haven't talked to anybody about it. I'm not interested. I read the newspaper and I'm absolutely bored. The Globe and Mail is just boring me nowadays because they're talking much more specifically, or maybe they always have, but it's bothering me more now. They talk about Canada exclusively. They hardly ever mention another country. And right. And I don't, it's not of interest to me. But I have friends who, are definitely community-based folks, and they see their neighbors. And I suppose in a way it's because I'm sort of housebound now and I no longer go to meetings, but I have very few roots in my community. I have no idea what's going on locally. But, I have strong opinions about who ought to be in charge of politics in Russia or so on. So I think it varies and by person. And maybe over time, the very fact that I can have a very rich social life doing what we're doing right now on Zoom without ever leaving my apartment means that I don't go out and I have no temptation to go out. I'm having more fun this way.
But I think that's perfect. I don't think there's any problem with that. Okay. I think people that are doing it exactly the way you do, and I travel a lot to meet different activists. I'm not stable enough to be rooted in community struggles anymore. I'm too much of a globetrotter. At least I was before the pandemic. But what I'm saying is that I think we need to recognize the old kind of truth of where do people power and strong social movements come from. Mm-hmm. They don't come from people that are not rooted in their communities. It comes from movements that are built up from below, and that strength in below is about housing. It's about land. It's about food. It's about social relations between people. That's where we are transforming our societies. I think there is too much of a focus on shifting individual leaders in capitals in countries, but the problem is, you can do that, but in what way are we dealing with the systemic problems of structural violence on our planet that way?
Well, that's the thing. So many of them, I think, more and more. The issues that we have to face are global in dimension, and I can. My neighbors may be very interested in the potholes in the street, But I mean, if the real problem is Himalayas, the glaciers are melting, you know, and they're going to cause floods and rains here, you know, having a good access to city council is not going to help you much.
No. So it's not about saying that the global is less important. It's not, that's not my point. My point is that if you have a community like the Zapatistas that are organizing their own health clinic, they create universal free healthcare for their community members, which is much more radical than what you can find anywhere in Mexico today. You find that in the poorest state of Mexico, in Chiapas, among the indigenous that are the poorest in that state, they organize free healthcare. If you have that, you have a possibility to fight for a change of healthcare on a national level in Mexico by showing an example, by being a community rooted with others. Zapatistas have involved themselves in international collaboration in a way that is going far beyond Chiapas.
Oh, really?
Yes. Oh, yes. Mm-hmm. I mean, they were just recently, last year, they made a reverse of the colonialism by invading Europe with a ship of Zapatistas that came to Europe and listened to activists in all countries in Europe to hear how their struggles are going.
I never heard that before.
Okay.
That's wonderful.
Yes.
I don't know anything about that. Where did they go? And tell me about it.
So they went on a long sailboat trip from Mexico to Europe. Yeah. They landed in Spain, like, you know, coming back to the colonial masters.
Columbus in reverse.
Exactly. They have this kind of humor in their approach to politics, which is very typical for them. And then they met with people, even in Sweden, the country where I come from, and many other countries. They were traveling around in groups, both men and women from the Zapatistas. And in a very typical way to them, they didn't come to lecture others about what they're doing, to tell others what to do. They were there to listen. Mm-hmm. So I think there is no contradiction between being very international and being local. The question is, where do you bring your strength? Is it only in numbers that show up in DC over the weekend? Or is it within communities that are trying to transform relationships to capitalism and the state and the military where you live? So I think that interconnection between those are creating far stronger movements that are clear about what society they want. So the day they overthrow the regime in DC, they will know what they want. You see what I mean?
I love what you're saying, and you're actually in touch with examples of it. So you can actually mention something like the Zapatistas, which I am actually not familiar with. Because the things that I follow most and know about and worry about are movements that need to be transnational, where there are very strong norms against it. I'm thinking, for example, of course, right now, the Ukraine and Russia conflict. Yeah. How much influence or how much support can we or should we offer to dissidents opposing their government's positions in either country, for that matter? I'm thinking, of course, primarily of Russia, but there are good reasons to say that there could be some policy changes well deserved in Ukraine too. But you know, the Russian public, I'm sorry to say, they are not people who, by and large, are given to huge movements of opposition. Maybe they got too burned with their revolution and figured out we don't want to do that again. Yeah. But for whatever reason, I've had a lot of contacts with people in Russia over the years, and I used to go every year or so. And I would say that that they're not easy to mobilize in a protest movement of any kind. Those who do, I have enormous respect for and fondness for, but it's not. They are not out in the streets in the same kind of numbers that you would expect in Serbia or someplace where they really did turn out. So and of course the rule is, I mean, Putin has come to power by saying that anybody who accepts money from or really is presumably in contact with peace activists in other countries, they're traitors and they're spies, and it's illegal. And as a matter of fact, the U.S. they don't enforce it the same way, but the U.S. has similar kinds of laws saying that, if you're a foreigner trying to influence politics in the U.S., you have to register as a foreign agent. I think it's not as sinister in the U.S. as it is in Russia, because they actually do throw people in jail for it, or strip them of all of their assets and take their computers and their office equipment away from them and so on. So, but now to me, and this is something that Peter Ackerman and I think Hardy Merriman may have written a book about, which I can't read because it's in such tiny print. They use this awful fashionable sans serif print these days so that people with eye troubles can't read it. But the wonderful book called something like The Right to Assist, or that was the name, one of the names of what they were proposing, that if there's a right, R2P, right to protect principle in international law, there should also be something like a right to assist dissidents in international law. Yeah. And it would be people like Ackerman himself who would have been helping people in other countries, or probably people like you. And I haven't had that conversation with many people, and I don't know that there's any upsurge in pressure in public opinion about changing the norms. But I really do believe that it's really important to allow foreigners to try to engage with people in the country who are maybe not comfortable with their own regime. What do you think?
No, I would, in principle, totally agree. I mean, we are talking about challenges in the world that has to do with authoritarianism and with exploitation of people and nature that are going across nation borders. And of course, all of us are influenced by what happens in China, what happens in the US, what happens in Europe, in Russia. All of us are influenced by it. So we have a legitimate concern, not only for protecting and assisting people that are our friends or for human rights, but actually also because the issues are typically transnational. So yes, I think it's fundamental for any kind of civil resistance or for any kind of social movement power that we are acting in solidarity with each other. Mm-hmm. But it needs to be based on the context and the wishes of the local people, because sometimes it's more dangerous to be in contact with someone from outside. It will be used against you. Mm-hmm. At other times, there are possibilities of finding ways of assistance. So I think one beautiful assistance that is possible to do in Europe, which is unfortunately not happening, would be to give a total amnesty and support for everyone that deserts from the military. That is an assistance that could be done without that it's interfering in a way that Putin could use against Western activists that are trying to influence, but it could be one way. So there are many ways, and I know that that work by Hardy Merriman and Peter Ackerman is something that is lifting up things like this. But we have to be clear that it's always problematic when we interfere. We need to do it in a way that doesn't become colonial, in a way that is not driven by Western interest, but by the concerns of those that know the situation, and that will be the local activists.
And they're not necessarily very unified, you know. I talked to, you know, they're for example, in Russia, I used to think that the most promising group of people who were very sort of pro democracy, let's say, would have been Yabloko. But, you know, now they are so fixated on opposing Navalny that you know, anybody who you'd have a hard time deciding, shall we support the Navalny people or the Yabloko people, if those were the only two. And in fact, there are many others, I'm sure. But they're not necessarily unified, and you have to choose which one you think is the most promising outfit to support.
Right. No, you're right. It's complicated. And again, I think there is no real way around that. We will be much more equipped in supporting in a war situation like in Ukraine today, if we would over the years have been developing relationships before this happened, right? And there are some groups in Europe that has developed relationships like that. So they will have much more easier to kind of determine which ones to support. But I agree, it's complicated. There are always so many different fractions.
Now, I have another radical proposal. I've been, since the war began, I began to believe that, you know, now is the time for us to seriously start planning the really big revisions in the New World Order that we're going to need for the post. I mean, we're coming up to all kinds of crises, and we need some big institutional changes. And so I've been writing a paper on what institutional changes we should do in what sequence. Well, you know, when it strikes me that the really biggest problem for global peace has to do with the fact that we have no way of enforcing international law. I mean, we have self-enforcement, we have sanctions, we have this or that. But when it comes to a country like something like the current thing, where Putin simply invades another country, I quite agree that there were, you know, he had some legitimate grievances, but not enough to legitimate this. And then what do? So you go to the International Court of Justice and you say, give us an opinion quickly, because we need an answer. Is this legitimate or not? And they say, no, Russia, you stop it. Get out of there right now. No, don't do that. And they might as well have stayed in bed that day, because there's no way that Russia's going to even blink at such a command. You know, international law is just nonsense. It doesn't matter at all in this situation. There is no way of forcing Putin to do anything to comply with any international law. And that's the problem. That's the biggest problem, I think. Mm-hmm. So what do? Do we want an international police force that could go get him? No, thank you. I'm as opposed to that as anybody else, because the minute you have a world government with a military that's sufficient to be able to subdue any country, you're going to have the perfect breeding ground for totalitarian world government. So thank you very much. I'm not in favor of having a world police force that's really that powerful to be able to go in and arrest the man or something, which is what somebody needs to do. Well, what's the alternative? The alternative is that the Russian people have to be responsible for ousting him themselves. Only, of course, they're very hesitant to do that. Many of them are very afraid that you get rid of him and then you just have nothing but a civil war or chaos. There's not even a successor, you know, in the wings waiting to potentially take over. So you would just have an awful mess. So what you'd have to do is create, I think, a system of change the UN and the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court and so on, and say that if the ICJ declares that somebody is a war criminal or what they're doing is a war crime and must be stopped, then with the consent of any other UN body, such as the General Assembly or the Security Council or could be, I don't know, some other thing, but I think you'd need at least some two or three international multilateral authorities that could collectively say, okay, we will authorize any Russian to apply to us for permission and legitimacy to oust this criminal ruler. And so we hereby indict applications from any group of people that has a plan for how you're going to try to do it. Come in and we will authorize you to do it. This is going to reduce the probability, which still remains a very live probability, that if you did something like oust Putin, that you would have real chaos or some civil war or something. Anyway, I think something like that is going to be the only way in which we can actually institute a system that people will legitimately support for enforcing international law. Tell me I'm full of it, if you think so.
No, I think you're on to a problem that is key here. I'm not sure about your solution, but I'm sure about that you're identifying really a key problem, which is that the world order system with the UN and different international bodies is created in the aftermath of the Second World War by the winners of that war and the superpowers of that situation with their nuclear weapons. So they created an order that is not built on people power and democracy, but it's built on their power and their nuclear weapons. So I think we need to be visionary and think about what would a just governance system look like on a world level. And we need to be creative here again in the same way as if we're talking about civil resistance movements that are overthrowing dictatorships, we need to have visions and ideas of what kind of other order would it be. And I think certainly it needs to be much more representative of the majority of the world. It can't be built on some absurd veto power from those that happens to have nuclear weapons. So I'm kind of more inclined towards that we are building a new United Nations, that we are taking the initiative to create a new body based on a new agreement. And if Russia and China and the United States don't want to join, that's too bad for them. We let's create something that is much more representative, that is much more democratic. And after a while, I think it might be a problem for them to not be part of it.
Okay.
And I have a colleague that is developing a proposal along this line. He's writing a book about it, and he's been working with the UN before. So I'm not married to any kind of particular solution, but I think you're exactly right that we have to recognize that on the international level, we don't have democracy, we don't have the rule of law. And who is exploiting that? Well, countries that are powerful enough are exploiting that all the time, including the US. So we need to see that world order is not serving us anymore with the kind of challenges we have with the climate and increasing of countries that are authoritarian.
Well, I'm glad to hear that there's somebody else thinking along similar lines. I certainly am thinking in terms of how to revise the UN in a very substantial way. I think there's a need for citizen citizen representation. In other words, the UN now, the members are states and not people. And
Yeah.
we really need to have what has often been called a parliamentary assembly, another house for the UN, another wing, a branch. And I think it could be, they talk about having it based on just having nation states already send delegates to represent people. But I think there needs to be a really direct relationship. And the thing that I'm playing with is a notion of a citizens' assembly based on a global participation voluntarily, people who sign up and say, I want to be part of the world system, I want to be a world citizen. And then they get the connections through their cell phones so that they can watch the deliberations. They can, and we would pick a citizens' assembly that is completely representative of the world's population in certain stratified ways.
No, I think you're right, and we need to be creative here. If we have more ideas like that, I think it's helpful. I want to mention another idea, which is the sorting principle that is used for advisory councils. It's when you actually have a list of people that are signing up, they're interested, but you make in the same way as a jury selection. You are randomly collecting people from that, so they become representative of a global majority of people.
That's built into this citizens' assembly idea. That's how it would be done. Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
So,
but half of my head says I can't trust the average voter, and it would be crazy to turn over, legal matters, legislation creation to ordinary citizens, because they obviously, this population is doing such a stupid job of voting people like Trump and Bolsonaro and Modi and all of these other Putin into power and making decisions that they don't even recognize global warming, and they work against gun control, and they're doing really crazy things, and the population can't be trusted to make decisions. Half of my head says that. The other half of my head says that's because they're just electing representatives. If you actually get people who are representative of the general population and you give them an opportunity and time together to work together and actually spend time deliberating before they make a decision, then the ordinary person is perfectly competent. And that's been proved by the fact that we've been using juries all these years, and nobody complains that it's unjust to select a representative sample of the population for the jury. So that's why I'm in favor, at least provisionally, I'm in favor of using something like sortition to select a representative population to actually make real decisions.
Yeah,
Let's
me
give it
too.
a try. Yeah,
okay. me too. Because I think that we have to recognize that the kind of system we have now is very much in the hands of very powerful states and very powerful elites. And I mean, it's also true when it comes to the US. I mean, there is this famous study from Harvard that is showing on, I think it's about 50 or even more issues that are controversial in the US, where they look at what does the political economic elite think about an issue, and what does the majority of the US population think. And on every one of these issues, the Congress is deciding according to the political economic elite and not according to what people in general think in the US. I mean, for example, when it comes to Roe versus Wade, we have 85 or 70% of something around that are in favor of abortion rights for women. But it's not the same opinion when you look at the political economic elite. So they go and have the influence in the system we have now. So I think it makes more sense to have ordinary people to have a time to not just go in and vote, but have time to reason with each other, like in a jury. So when they have time to reason together, I agree with you. I think their opinion will be more reasonable, so to speak, more democratic than if we are having a system that favors people that have millions in political campaigns to get into certain positions. They will rule in the interest of those corporate elites.
That's been actually shown that people who study the effectiveness of citizens' assemblies, they say that in general, the results are more progressive than they would have expected beforehand. You know, when people come in, they're a mixture of things, but after deliberation, they tend to become more progressive. Excuse me.
Because these people don't have a vested interest with the fossil industry or the military industry. They're not being paid from them. I think maybe the key here is that we shouldn't get too stuck into one particular solution, but we should really fight for the principles of the democracy and social justice for the population that lives on this planet. It's unacceptable that there are certain states that consume 80% of the energies and the resources, and they're 20% of the population of the world. That's only because they have privileged power in terms of military and positions within an international system that is not favoring the ordinary population of the planet. We need to think in terms of another system. It needs to be based on principles that are about democracy and justice. So what that looks like, I'm not sure. But we need to be visionary enough to believe that that kind of things are necessary and could be made. I mean, it was what we have now was made in the aftermath of the Second World War. This could be made here if we have the visions.
You know, I hope that somehow people who are thinking about these issues get in touch and we form a network of people who share ideas and discuss exactly this kind of thing. Yeah. Because, you know, I come up with my own independent notion of how to solve these problems, but this needs to be discussed. There are a lot of other people who've got better ideas.
Right.
So I hope that, you know, whatever your friend is doing in terms of creating a new United Nations, I'd like to be in touch and find out about it.
I'll put you in touch.
All right. That's fine. It's been wonderful to get acquainted with you after all these years.
Same, Mette. The same.
So let's, you know, keep sharing information and ideas. It's good to have a brand new ally and friend in Massachusetts.
I agree. It's been my pleasure to take part and talk to you here.
Okay, carry on. See you again. Bye. Project Save the World produces these shows 3 days a week, sometimes even more. And this is episode number 472. You can watch these or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. Sometimes we even post the transcripts there when we get around to it. And when you get there, look around. We have conversations there about 6 global issues, plus potential reforms in governance, economics, and civil society. To find a particular talk show, enter its title or episode number in the search bar, or the name of one of the guest speakers. After you've watched or listened, scroll down and share your own thoughts about the show. This is a place for dialogue. Project Save the World also produces a quarterly online publication, Peace Magazine. You can buy a single copy or subscribe for $20 Canadian per year through Pressreader. Just go to pressreader.com on your browser, and in the search bar, enter the word peace. You'll see the cover of the current issue and buttons to click to subscribe.